Two armies stood encamped on either side of a mountain, with a valley running between them. On one side was the Philistines, and the other, the Israelites. They were in the Israelites' territory in Judah, but the Philistines had the advantage. They were larger, bigger, and stronger. Plus, the Philistines had Goliath. Goliath was huge. He was 6 cubits tall, which, if we knew how tall a cubit was, would be really impressive, we're sure. But suffices to say here that he was big and mean and probably ugly. And as those two sides faced off on either mountain with a valley running between them, perhaps hoping to avoid a protracted, prolonged war, Goliath stepped out of line. He had a challenge for the Israelites. He said, "Send forth a champion to fight me." And this was the wager, that if that champion could defeat Goliath, then the Philistines would submit to the Israelites. But if the Israelites couldn't defeat Goliath, then they would submit to the Philistines. Their homes, their land, their God. No one, of course, took him up on his offer. And so both sides prepared for war. And for 40 days, they would gather together, line up, each on their respective mountain with a valley running between. And each day in the morning and in the evening, Goliath would step out and make his charge. And each day, the Israelites would cower in fear. They were paralyzed with fear. Fear has a way of doing that to us, keeping us in our place, making us want to step back into the line lest we become a target. We've seen it this week, haven't we? As we've watched with anxiety the news of bombs in New York City, of stabbings in Minnesota, of shootings in Washington, of racially charged violence in Charlotte. And it's easy watching those reports to find ourselves becoming increasingly fearful, to want to hole ourselves up, to build up a wall that can protect us from all of those on the outside, to keep us from anyone who might scare us. And for some of us, that works. Some have built entire political campaigns on the idea of fear of the other. And while that might work for some, the challenge for us as Christians is that it is antithetical to the gospel. That as a people of faith, we can't cower in fear. It's hard to love your neighbor through a wall. That we're not a people who can stop at fear. It's okay to be scared. The world is scary. But it's not okay to allow that fear to keep us from one another. We have to, for the sake of the gospel, move through our fear with love. This is the hard part of being a Christian. It's not just about being nice or being a good person. Those things help. It's about standing up when we want to sit down. It's about speaking out when we want to stay silent. It's about going when we want to stay. We don't know what a day may bring. That's part of the freedom that God gives us to live in this world, but we know that we have today. And we know how we are called to live in it. And the good news is that if we're scared, we don't have to face tomorrow alone. And we are fortunate that we have a whole history of people who have helped show us the way. Today, our dream weaver represents one of them. Frederick Douglass found his Goliath early in his life. Only it was much bigger than 6 cubits tall, and had many, many heads, and the valley which separated his side from the other side stretched across several states, not to count the hearts and minds of so many others. And in that day, even those who were opposed to slavery thought that it was indefeatable. That was an insurmountable object that no one could overcome, and so they settled for appeasing bits of legislation like the Kansas-Nebraska Act or the Missouri Compromise, acts intended to hold slavery at bay, but not able to destroy it altogether. But Douglass seemed to know that while injustice was allowed to live for some, all would be kept from life. Like Harriet Tubman last week, Frederick Douglass was lent out to other masters on the eastern shore of Maryland. And while he was in Baltimore, he heard for the first time the word abolitionist. Only he had no idea what it meant. All he knew was that he liked it because it seemed to annoy his masters. And anything that annoyed his masters pleased him. He had surreptitiously taught himself to read, and so when his masters left, he pulled out his dictionary, he looked up the word abolition, and he read the definition, the act of abolishing, which he found not helpful at all. It didn't tell him what they were trying to get rid of. And so he spent the next few weeks struggling, listening every time he heard the word come up to understand what it was they were talking about, until he happened upon a Baltimore newspaper one evening. And he heard about legislation being put forth for the abolishment of slavery. It was the first glimpse of hope he had in his life. It was the first moment that he recognized that others saw the injustice of his situation, and even better, were trying to do something about it. And he knew from the way it annoyed his masters that these abolitionists must have some power. After all, why else would it annoy them so much? And he was bound and determined to add to that power, to offer whatever insight he could to the cause, first through the slaves that he was friends with, and then, when he was a freeman, to the whole world. He was scared, but he also knew what he was called to do. David was just a shepherd boy, the youngest of his brothers. And on this particular day, his father Jesse told him to go into the encampment and to bring bread to his brothers and cheese to the commander of the armies. And so, a dutiful son, he brought the bread and cheese, and he expected when he got there to find a battle raging. But instead, he saw 2 lines lined up against each other on either side of a mountain with a valley running between. And he found his way up, and he saw Goliath off in the distance, raging, shaking his fist at this army which was cowering in fear. And as David got closer, he began to hear murmurings among the Israelite soldiers about what would be given to the person who could stand up to Goliath. His ears perked up. He heard of the riches and the daughter of the king. And he started to grow excited, and as he began to ask them about it, his brother overheard him and stepped out of the line. He chastised him for not being back in the fields and yelled at him for asking impertinent questions of the soldiers. David, in truly teenager fashion, says to his brother, "It's only a question." And then he turns and he asks again the soldiers, what will be given to the person who defeats Goliath? And he asks again and again and starts to grow more and more exciting until eventually his questions get back to King Saul. And King Saul invites David into his tent to meet with him and to ask him what it is he's trying to do. But before King Saul can ask anything, David just blurts out something to the effect of, "I'll take care of your Goliath problem." We can imagine Saul looking at this young boy and then looking across the valley to this giant man and then back to the young boy and then back out to the giant man before he finally says, "But you're only a boy." To which David responds proudly that he's been able to take care of the predators that have come after his sheep in the field, and that he's done it very well. That he's able to do whatever he can hold his own, plus he will have God on his side. As Frederick Douglass would later say, one and God makes a majority. Saul, somehow seeing logic in David's argument, puts the fate of the entire Israelite army on David's shoulders. But first he puts some armor on David. He fits him with his sword and with his armor, which is all very nice, save for one thing, that when he has it on, David can't move, like at all. And so he abandons the armor, takes up a staff of a shepherd, and 5 smooth stones he places in his bag. And with his sling in hand, he steps away from the Israelite line, undoubtedly wondering how, in the course of a few hours, he went from delivering cheese to being the person fighting single-hand combat for the entire fate of his people. When Frederick Douglass found his way out of slavery through Philadelphia and New York, he landed in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And though the docks were denied to him because of the color of his skin, he found some work and was able to bring the young woman he had met in Baltimore up so that they could be married. And in his new life that he was establishing in Massachusetts, he one day came across a newspaper, The Liberator, written by William Lloyd Garrison. He said he put that paper second only to the Bible because it was the first time he read in print that prejudice against color was rebellion against God. Pleased to be a part of the conversation, to know that the conversation was happening, he began to attend anti-slavery rallies around Massachusetts. And one day, as he was sitting listening to an abolitionist speaker, the abolitionist speaker spotted Douglass, and having heard some tales about him speaking up at some of the meetings, invited Douglass onto stage. Douglass didn't want to go, but the man insisted, and so Douglass stood on stage saying he could hardly put 2 words together, saying later that his embarrassment was likely the best part of his speech that day. But the crowd was mesmerized. And Garrison, who followed Douglass that evening, invited Douglass to be a part of the lecture circuit. And join him he did. Douglass found his voice and didn't stop using it for the rest of his life. First out loud and then in print. Many will know that he came to Rochester, New York, where he, first on Alexander Street and then on South Avenue, established his own newspaper, the North Star, later renamed to the Frederick Douglass Paper, where he would write all day long and then get on a train that would take him out to Victor, to Farmington, to Canandaigua, to Geneva, where he would speak in the evening, get back on the latest train he could, and come back so that he could start writing again first thing in the morning. He found a home in Rochester for 25 years, and he said of the city something that we probably think is still true. That is, that Rochester is a city not so rich as to be indifferent to the needs of the poor, but not so poor as to not be able to help. He recognized that Rochester was a place where he could change the world, where his dream of a different kind of world, a world in which justice exists, could come true. People used to say that you couldn't get within 500 miles of Rochester without the thought of Frederick Douglass invading your speech, without coming into contact with what it was that Douglass was trying to do. He became so influential in this world that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln called Douglass in for a meeting at the White House. They didn't see eye to eye on everything, but Douglass said that Lincoln treated him better than any other leader of the day. There's even a story that as Lincoln and Douglass were talking one day, the governor of Connecticut came in and wanted to interrupt them. Douglass tried to make a graceful farewell, but Lincoln sent a message out to the governor of Connecticut saying, "Tell Governor Buckingham to wait. I want to have a long talk with my friend Frederick Douglass." Douglass spent his entire life using his voice to try and defeat the Goliath of his day. And once slavery ended, he kept using his voice to fight against the injustices of this world. He was instrumental in passing the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And when that was done, he started to stand up for women's suffrage. He was a man who saw what needed to be done in this world and used the voice he had to lend itself to the cause. He did it not for himself, but for the world around him. He felt compelled by the gospel to use the gift given to him. To be clear, there was violence in that day. We can't ignore the Civil War, but Douglass tried to fight against it, to find restitution, to work for reconciliation. He spent his life crossing that valley to make relationships that worked so that all could eat at the same table. He used his voice over violence. He did it for himself, not for himself, but for others, which, if we're honest, is what makes him different than David. David, as we know, as he grows in years, will have some humbling to do. We know the story of David doesn't end that well. He's not a particularly kind king, though he might have been a good one. And in this moment, David, so convinced that he's right, so convinced that God is on his side, allows himself to be goaded by the taunts of Goliath. And he doesn't stop when he slings his stone with decapacitating Goliath. Instead, he decapitates him. And then he sends the entire Israelite army in to slaughter the Philistines. He meets violence with more violence, injustice with more injustice, claiming the whole time that God is on his side. And if we're honest, friends, as we hear this kind of story, it hits a little too close to home. We know through our own history and through our world right now how dangerous it is to claim that God is on our side. To look out and assume that we are so right and everyone else is so wrong, and so let's back ourselves into whatever corner we can. Injustice in the face of injustice causes all to suffer. To be clear, there are Goliaths out there worth standing up to, friends. But we can't do it with violence. It has to be with love. We have to find our way to reach out, to get past our fearfulness of the other, to cross the valley, and to figure out who is on the other side. And if it seems like the gap is too big, like we can't figure it out, maybe we should start small by reaching out a hand, by lifting up our voice, by opening up our arms with love. Yes, it's scary, but we are not in this alone. Douglas wanted justice. He dreamed of justice. Maybe we do too. Sometimes the only way to bring a dream to life is to live it. One step at a time. Amen.